Good afternoon and welcome to this edition of Microsoft's Sustainability Dialogues in Saudi Arabia, where we are bringing together some of the best minds in the area of sustainability to sort of advance the thesis of how we all individually, collectively, as companies, as economies, as societies, migrate towards the great goal of net zero at a very exciting time in which the COP events are coming to the Middle East, to Egypt this year, COP27, COP28 next year in the UAE. And of course, here in Saudi Arabia, we're sitting right in the middle of all of that. So welcome to this edition. We're going to take on the challenge of the topic, how to accelerate energy transition and sustainability in Saudi Arabia. It's not a small goal, but inevitably every little bit helps. Every little idea contributes to the bigger goal. Let's kick off today with our host, Omar Saleh, who some of you know well, Vice President, Enterprise Business of Microsoft Arabia. Omar, maybe you could give us some of your opening thoughts.
Thank you, Sean, and very excited to be joining my fellow panelists on this podcast. I think the topic is very exciting, energy transition. It's happening. It's the momentum is grabbing all around, and to your point, we're at the center of all of this in Saudi. We're very excited about the announcements and the commitments that the Saudi government and His Royal Highness Mohammed bin Salman have already announced for Saudi. It sets a path for the business transformation at large. I think it's opening windows for a lot of opportunities. We are excited as well from a technology perspective because we know there is a lot of momentum and a lot of enablement that builds on digital, and we believe we have a major role to lead with this at Microsoft. Of course, we had our commitments set earlier. We are projecting and we have already committed to be carbon negative by 2030, to be water positive by the same date, and zero waste. And we're also compensating for all the carbon that we've ever emitted by 2050. We plan to compensate for all of this. And it's very exciting to see many businesses in Saudi and in the region following the same pursuit. And I think we've seen some of the large oil and gas companies on that same path as well, not only for adding some of the renewable assets to their portfolios, but also setting themselves on an agenda of becoming net zero on emissions by specific dates. So very exciting times and looking forward to the discussion.
Omar, if I might just come back to you quickly, just for a short enough sort of feedback, if indeed there is a short answer, but water positive seems quite an interesting challenge. In what sense of the time frame is that, and what would be your low-hanging fruit to achieve that?
So typically we follow a methodology that we call the 5 R's, how we record, how we report, and then typically how we reduce and replace. That's on the carbon front, but also when it comes to the water management, we're tracking pretty much the same. So we have committed to be water positive by 2030. That's where we get a sense of how much water we are consuming, and all the way from our office space to our data center operations to all our operations at large, where water is coming, whether it's in a manufacturing process or it's in the consumption in the office space, and how we compensate for that accordingly, or otherwise we come to zero water kind of management systems altogether.
Let's welcome Engineer Fahad Alajian, President of the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, CAPSARC, as it's framed, who's had a long career in the Saudi energy sector, formerly with the Saudi Energy Ministry. Engineer Fahad, we'd welcome your opening thoughts on this sort of greater goal, accelerating energy transition and sustainability in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you, Sean. Yeah, thank you for hosting us here. When it comes to the climate change, I think Saudi started from the beginning, looking back at all the ways from the 80s and the beginning of the 90s with the Rio Convention and then the Kyoto Protocol. And I think with the announcement of the Saudi Green Initiative last October, Saudi wanted to move into becoming a leader in addressing climate change. We recognize the role of oil and gas in transforming the lives over the past 100 years. But we also want to address the environmental concerns, especially the emissions that are coming from hydrocarbons and fossil fuel in general. And so Saudi, when it announced, the ambition to reach net zero by 2060, a doubling of the NDCs. If you look at it, Saudi Arabia accounts for almost 1.5% of the global emission, yet the NDCs represent 4% of the global reduction. So it aims to be a leader, not only looking at itself, but it's also regionally with the launch of the Middle East Green Initiative by trying to copy and collaborate with other countries in the region, whether within the Gulf region or the greater Middle East, to try and incorporate a lot of the discussion, a lot of the best practices into making sure that the world meets its targets for net zero. When you look at the Saudi net zero ambition, it's one of the few emerging economies that have not based this on any condition. If you look at other countries that like the financing or technology transfer, I think Saudi Arabia has only made it, dependent on the maturing of the technology, which is Saudi plays a role, but also globally, we need to, cooperate to actually develop and enhance those technologies and bring down the cost to make sure we can achieve, the net zero ambition in an economically sustainable way.
Fad, you have a very unique sort of combination. You're both an MBA, also a mechanical engineer. Obviously, these two worlds coming together, the economic, the financing, the viability. How important is that in the pursuing of these solutions, that they are ultimately economically viable and sustainable as a result, perhaps?
It is critical and essential that all of the solutions and technologies that we want to achieve net zero are financially and economically viable. The government can play a role in helping in funding new technology and new research, but when it comes to the mass deployment that all of these technology needs, we need the private sector to take the lead. And we have a great model with renewable projects. Renewable projects, if you go anywhere, you can easily finance it. The cost of financing is low, and that's why we have seen this tremendous increase in renewable capacity, that each year we're adding almost the same number of the installed capacity in gigawatt hours. And so it's been an incredible success story. It's not enough. We need to copy this model and refine it and make sure that we deploy it for other technology when it comes to hydrogen, when it comes to carbon capture, when it comes to direct air capture. So we have to make sure that the business model is there to help the private sector in deploying all the capital that is needed, because it's not a trivial sum. We're talking the trillions and trillions of dollars.
It is big, big numbers. Well, somebody who knows a bit about big numbers is the next speaker, Dr. Bob Maughan, who's Executive Vice President, Chief Technology Officer, and Chief Sustainability Officer of SABIC, of course, one of the world's largest petrochemical companies and dealing in multi-billion dollars. And Dr. Maughan, of course, you have throughout your career been at the commercial end of R&D, where the rubber meets the road, so to speak. Your thoughts on the achieving of this goal as we've set ourselves today?
Yeah, no, thank you. And look, it's a privilege to be with this group to talk about this issue. And I think it's extremely timely. I think as most companies in our sector and in industries have made commitments related to our path to carbon neutrality, many of them late last year, and in fact with us at the Saudi Green Initiative announcing our targets, we're at a critical juncture, right, of declaring an ambition, but needing it to be executable into a roadmap that, as Engineer Fahad eloquently said, right, is connected to strong business case and to affordability, but at the same time aimed at that broader ambition. And I think one thing that has me very excited on the one level is the opportunity in Saudi Arabia to be a part of this transition, right? If you look at the availability of low-cost solar and wind, if you look at the availability for carbon capture and storage opportunity, Saudi Arabia is extremely well positioned to play a key role in that transition. And of course, with technologies that are essential for our industry to make that happen. So, again, we made our commitment in October of last year on carbon neutrality, but it was built on a very clear 18-month path, working with our businesses to define a roadmap to do that. So it's based on real projects, real initiatives, but that are tied to building a clear business case for implementation. So look forward to the dialogue here, but really excited about the potential and the path that we're on.
Bob, given your background and the business case, obviously you're Chief Technology Officer with SABIC and Chief Sustainability Officer, which is kind of an interesting combination vis-a-vis those two hats in one. I know we're all wearing multiple hats these days for all sorts of efficiency reasons, but nonetheless, CTO and CSO, I haven't seen that before. What's the thinking?
Yeah, no, actually, it's becoming more and more common, to be honest. I mean, if you look at examples, DuPont has the same set of roles at their company, and many in our industry are moving in that direction. And I think it stems from a realization that if you go back a few years ago, sustainability was really oftentimes connected to either risk management and EHSS, or it was connected to corporate affairs and external positioning. And what's needed now, honestly, is a connection to executable projects. Like we're not at a point now where we can sort of have an aspirational view of telling great stories around what we're doing, but we actually have to have real tangible projects. And so I think you're going to see examples of that connection of the CSO role to technology or to business and operations, but into much more groups that are tied to the execution of activities in the market. So for me, that was a big attractor to coming to SABIC and taking the role because, our CEO, Yusuf Al-Binyan, saw very clearly a need to connect our technology pipeline, both internal and what we might leverage in, and connecting that to the pathway to delivering on carbon neutrality and making sure that there's an intimate connection on where we resource innovation and making sure that it's tied to those outputs. So that's why we did it. Again, similar announcements at companies like DuPont and others. But I think you're going to see, again, not that it has to be tied to technology, but that the roles have to be tied to sort of clear, actionable parts of organizations, as opposed to simply using sustainability and corporate affairs as sort of a positioning, of stories. It has to be tied to actions.
Well, it is, I think, not an insignificant point in the context of job description, but the blending of, and also the intention it demonstrates. I was involved in a gathering recently in which one of the speakers was a chief failure officer, which I thought was quite interesting, because he was responsible for ensuring that the lessons were learned from the failures of, and so encouraging the fact that people would pursue and not be too risk averse. So that's, I think, a notable part of maybe the journey that we're on, and not an insignificant one. Let's welcome Ben Cahill, Senior Fellow, Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In itself, a kind of another interesting combination, because sometimes they would be seen to be in somewhat conflict. Energy security versus climate change, they have been a little bit of a question how they go together. And we welcome, Ben, your opening thoughts.
Well, thanks, Sean. It's great to be with you and with this group. I've already learned quite a bit from the fellow panelists. And I like the idea of having failure in your title occasionally. That's a good thing to remember. I'll have to keep that in mind. One of the things that I've been working on a bit is how major resource holding countries and national oil companies are changing their mandates with the energy transition. And it's been fascinating to watch what's happened in the Gulf states and in Saudi Arabia in the last couple of years. I mean, obviously, states like Saudi Arabia have huge advantages in the energy transition. We all know we're going to need continued investment in fossil fuels for a long time to come. And these countries like Saudi Arabia have big advantages. You have extremely large scale, low cost resources and low carbon intensity resources. And those are the kinds of oil and gas that will be advantaged. And yet you're starting to see Saudi Aramco, other state companies pivot in a major way towards sustainability, towards changing their business lines and trying to make these new areas profitable and innovative, as Bob and the others pointed out. And Aramco obviously has big advantages, and one of the advantages is that it works in this ecosystem in Saudi Arabia where you have other state companies that are capable, that are capitalized. You have strong state support and a push for things like renewable energy, both blue and green hydrogen. There are a lot of advantages for carbon capture and sequestration due to the geology. A lot of market advantages, in this quest to make long distance exports of blue hydrogen, blue ammonia economically competitive. When you think about the geographic location of Saudi Arabia, the ports, the export capacity, the links with customers in Asia and elsewhere, big natural advantages. And so to me, the understanding national oil companies like Aramco is all about understanding what the state wants and needs and how those economic objectives are changing over time. And I think outside the Gulf region, we tend to underestimate a bit how much the Gulf states are changing, how much the economic and political drivers are changing. And, you know, this train is moving and all the companies are jumping on board, and it's having a big material impact on people, resources, and objectives.
Well, in some ways, I think regionally, the acceleration of the transition towards its commitment is becoming very tangible in the roadmaps that countries are building in the region. We're not seeing so much in other places that are getting disrupted by a lot of events that are happening in the world. But not to get too distracted, Ben, to our cause today, I would sort of like to come back to you on where do you think the low-hanging fruit is here in the accelerating of the transition in the kingdom? Particularly welcome your views in and around the fuel mix into the power sector.
Yeah, I mean, one of the goals is to develop hydrogen, both blue and green. And so this is a question of how you use natural gas resources. There will be incredible growth in renewable energy in Saudi Arabia. We've seen this with the tenders that have been awarded in the last couple of years, the growth that started to happen. There's a very ambitious goal of, I think, 50% of power being provided by renewable energy by 2030. What that does is it frees up other resources for other uses, both for domestic use of natural gas in the power sector to displace liquids, potentially for export. You know, a lot of things become possible when you start to develop renewable energy so quickly. And I think that this is a big policy change. I mean, the reality is that Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states have been, you know, energy inefficient over time and how they've used domestic energy at home. But getting into the solar game, solar PV, in a big way is important. And Saudi Arabia obviously has some big cost advantages in terms of solar radiation. And so I see this is kind of a broader systemic change in the way that energy is used, and economic efficiency is maximized in a way that I think is really important.
Engineer Fad, I'd welcome your thoughts if we just sort of look a little bit again on this, keeping to the specific, if we can, about next steps in achieving this idea of accelerating energy transition and sustainability in the kingdom. What would be identifiable, tangible next steps?
So, you know, this started maybe 10 years ago, Sean. I mean, if you look at, you know, the first start maybe 10 years ago, Saudi set up the Saudi Energy Efficiency Program, which looked at how can we consume energy in a more efficient way. And even though it started slowly, you can now see it touches, you know, every person's life within Saudi Arabia. If you go buy a car, if you go buy an air conditioning, if you go and buy a fridge, you will see a tag showing you how efficient this equipment, this utility is. And now this is being extended into the industrial sector, into the utility sector to make sure you raise the efficiency. The same thing is happening with the government building, where there is a government-owned, a PIF-owned company, Tarshid, which is now retrofitting all the government building to make them, you know, more energy efficient. We see the roadmap to renewable, as Ben mentioned, around, you know, having 50% of renewable generating, you know, 50% of your electricity by 2030. Now I think the focus is now trying to move into from, you know, pilot project and independent project more into hub and a strategic approach. And I think so. For example, if you look at what Ben mentioned around, you know, blue hydrogen. Saudi Arabia has a plan to, for example, to develop Jubail area, which is a heavily industrialized area, into a CCUS hub that will help you with hydrogen, but it will also help you in achieving, you know, a lot of the reduction in emissions and utilization of that CO2 into, you know, other value products, including synthetic fuel and fertilizers and so on. But the whole idea is to move away from a single approach where company by company go and develop their own project, and to have a systematic approach, because the network effect, the infrastructure that you develop will help in lowering the cost of abatement, the cost of technology as you further deploy them. Then, you know, comes the difficult part, which is beyond 2030. What should we do beyond 2030? And I think that's where we look to corporate entities and leaders like Aramco, SABIC, aqua power, into advancing the technologies that we have today, or coming up with new technologies, things like hydrogen. How can we make sure that green hydrogen become competitive, but also the issue around the value chain and transportation, direct air capture, where we're talking about a negative emission technology that would help in reducing emissions and the footprint of not only countries that have heavy industry, but you can look at it even for non-concentrated CO2 emissions. And so that's, I think, where we look for corporates like Aramco and SABIC and Aqua and others, even globally, because I think that's the benefit of working within a global environment, that you can learn the lessons similar to what happened with renewable. Renewable, were a dream 30 years ago. Now it's the lowest cost of generating utility. And so I think until 2030, there is a clear roadmap. But after that, this is where we need to invest in technology and look especially to the private sector. When you see a company like Aramco that has, the highest patent filing of all the oil and gas company, that tells you that these companies are investing significant amount in technology. And I think energy transition and emission technology is one of the, most important topics that we need to address.
Bob, on that, just picking up on that point, where the implementation, adoption of technology, but sitting within an innovative culture, right? I mean, in a sense, there's many parts to Aramco now, even many parts to Aramco and SABIC as two major industries now, at least 1/10 in a country with many others. How do we advance innovation and innovative culture even within the size of that company and then across? How important is connectivity, breaking down the verticals? I think you're on mute, Bob. Sorry.
Apologize for that. It's important to break those verticals down internally as well as externally in how we collaborate, right? So as an industry, the approach that we took in SABIC is maybe as an example, right, as a way to break those down, was we started with a mandate from the CEO that we were going to deliver on a net neutrality target, right? So once we did it, and not that we would own that within technology or within sustainability, but that target would be owned by the business units themselves. And it was an excellent way to sort of break some of these internal barriers, because the businesses were then given a clear objective to deliver on a target for 2050. We then put together cross-functional teams to go figure out how would we do that, what technologies will we need internally, what technologies.
Sorry, Bob. Would they be rewarded for that in terms of?
Absolutely. So what I would say is that the initial stage was to develop that roadmap. We did it cross-functionally. But then now that we have a roadmap, execution of that roadmap, both for the near term and on the path to 2030 and the longer term to 2050, is directly connected to executive compensation. So, all of a sudden it becomes not, one function pushing an initiative, but everybody working together to deliver that. So, near term, a lot of those activities, I think, as well said by Fahad, are driven, especially for SABIC. Near term, they're driven by efficiency and reliability, which gives us a significant portion of our reduction. They're driven by the increased renewable energy in our assets, right, that addresses our emissions. They're driven by some incremental electrification of assets where we can easily implement that before 2030. And then lastly, they're tied to the first initial investments around hydrogen and carbon capture, right, that can be delivered by 2030. But to go beyond 2030, and I think, again, to the points that Ben and Fahad and others have made, requires more significant breakthrough. But again, those are owned with the business and ourselves, a clear roadmap on what technologies are needed to go do that. It requires a significant ramp up of both blue and green hydrogen. It requires significant ramp up of carbon capture capability. And it requires electrification of new parts of our processes, right? So as an example, and just to give you a perspective, if you look at the chemical industry emissions on the direct emissions from our assets, 85% of those are simply the heat used to drive processes. It's not the result of producing the wrong products or being inefficient. It's actually the fact that you just need heat to drive the thermodynamics of these processes, and that heat invariably is usually driven by natural gas, right? So electrifying furnaces, whether it be electrifying reformers, electrifying the furnaces and crackers, these are the essential areas to go help us in the decarbonization path. We've made a significant announcement with BASF and Linde to go develop that technology, and are actually putting a pilot facility in place in Europe to demonstrate that technology. And that will be brought back into the kingdom as part of our plans, along with these other elements I mentioned, like carbon capture and hydrogen. So again, to me, the way you break the barrier down is you set a clear aspirational objective, and you give ownership of that to the broader company, and you tie compensation to delivering against it, right? And those are all the elements that help to immediately remove barriers and provide, I think, more than the barriers, shared accountability, right, for the pathway that we're on.
Omar, I'd just like to bring you in on that. I mean, in terms of the country as a whole, obviously. Oh, sorry, Bob is still talking, and I cannot hear him. Can you hear me, Bob?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I could hear you now, but there was a gap there. I don't know, was that just me, or could others hear? No, you're cutting in and out, Bob. I'm just going to say your connection seems to be on your audio is not connecting.
Not much I can do about it.
So, okay. I'm just going to take a pause, Bob, and go to Omar. Sorry. Omar, I just wanted to get you in on that point. Ultimately, we're talking about that idea of the verticals and the next steps of where those two meet. This in the kingdom, of course, we have very large companies and a past in which top-down led on a lot of things. Innovation, of course, needs the ground up as well. And I wanted your thoughts on how that plays a role or should play a role to accelerate this transition. Omar, and you're on mute. Oh, there you're on.
I think, yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, perfect. Yep.
Yep. No, I think innovation calls for ecosystems altogether, Sean. And I think as an example of this is what we're doing with SABIC, for example, today, maybe not necessarily on the energy efficiency and the decarbonization at large, but more on the waste management. So just as a point, to our audience, we had one of our products, we call it the Ocean Mouse, that's manufactured from plastics that are basically extracted from the oceans. 20% of what it's composed of is really waste that we have took back, from our oceans. And we have a plan through this partnership to grow the percentage of such plastics, in our products altogether. So the point I'm making is it's all building on partnerships. One of the things that Bob touched on is electrification, for example. And this is adding a lot of pressure, on the grids. And that's where technology plays a major role in how we can modernize, our grids altogether. Yeah. The carbon capture and storage, that calls for big partnerships. An example of this is what we're doing in the project of Northern Lights in Norway. We're partnering with Shell, Total, Equinor, and the Norwegian government to be able to put a pilot for a carbon capture and storage end-to-end system. And today we are progressing in a very solid manner. The liquidification of carbon, we have a capacity of 1.5 million tons a year. We're growing that hopefully to 100 million tons. That's the capacity of that plant. It's direct air capture, and of course it's used, for the enhanced oil recovery altogether. There is also many areas of innovation, first in recognizing or at least in tracking the emissions at the first place. So we're talking about methane detection and tracking, and the use of satellite imagery, and how you bring that, with IoT systems, and how you can basically stand on the magnitude of the issue. And we're doing a big project on that, Project Astra, in the Gulf of Mexico in partnership with ExxonMobil. It's all about partnerships. That's the point, Sean, in order to accelerate that path of innovation.
Ben, the acceleration piece, you talked a little in your earlier point about the national energy companies, the NOCs as they're called. Obviously, they're major institutions, major corporate. I mean, Aramco is now the biggest company in the world by market cap. They have had, to different degrees, accelerated, lagging in terms of digital adoption, different generations of technology. But at this moment, it seems that in some ways that might be the moment of advantage, because you can accelerate beyond. You're not burdened by legacy infrastructure is my point. How much of an opportunity does that present in a play like Saudi Arabia, where that legacy infrastructure can be left over because it's not there, and ultimately it opens a greenfield opportunity?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the energy transition means that customer demands are changing, and new business opportunities are opening up. And if you think about national oil companies as a whole, it's a very fragmented picture. You have haves and have-nots. You have some NOCs that are going to fall behind because they're losing equity partners, technology partners. They're not the most competitive places for investment. You have a lot of private companies that are withdrawing from exploration and production and assets around the world. At the other end of the spectrum, you have NOCs like Saudi Aramco, which are, among the world's best engineering companies, project management companies. They've got the scale, the capital, the resources. And so when it comes to pivoting to these areas, like, scaling up direct air capture on a big scale, or carbon capture, utilization, and storage on a very large scale, these countries are the best laboratories to do it, and you have NOCs that are well positioned to take advantage of it. And so I see that a lot of the engineering and the tech capacity, as Omar and Bob and others have pointed out, is really being redirected to these areas because they're growth areas and they're areas of competitive advantage. Mm-hmm. And I think Aramco, in the same way that it's been a leader in downhole technology and a lot of the tech required to produce oil and gas most efficiently, it's going to pivot and direct those resources to things like blue and green hydrogen, low carbon fuels. And again, this is about trying to figure out where customer demand will develop and evolve over the coming decade and beyond, and be there to meet it. Another advantage, which I mentioned earlier, is that if you think about energy flows of the future, a lot of it is going to be oriented around this east of Suez, Middle East to Asia axis. And so it's about being a partner to countries like Japan and South Korea and China as they try to lower the carbon intensity of their fuels and procure the cleaner stuff. And so I see kind of a race happening to develop those markets and develop a bit of a first mover advantage. And obviously I think that Saudi Arabia has some big advantages there, a leg up.
Well, one of them, perhaps, welcome Engineer Fad's view on this, the idea of, the big challenge all over the world, attracting the talent to change, the idea of how do you bring more technologically savvy younger generation up to speed and interested in the transition, and where employee value propositions speaks to that intersection. How does that feel from a perspective, obviously, CAPSARC attracting some of the most brightest minds? How big a challenge and opportunity is that in the kingdom with such a young population?
So I think we're blessed in Saudi because I think we have a younger population that's very, I would call them digitally native. And they've been, trained, their education is of the highest standard. And you can find, people who are trained either locally or even in the US or the UK, in China, and so on. So I think we've been blessed. And at CAPSARC, I think so, we actually had a strategy reset over the past, 18 months, where we've actually moved and changed our mission and vision, and we want to be more of an advisory think tank. So that is very focused on tangible results for policymakers, whether domestic or globally. And I think
so. When you say that, Fad, advisory think tank rather than doing applied research, or at the intersection where those come together?
No, I think it's the intersection of the two. And so I think that's where we want to focus, is how can we actually make sure that policymakers have the right tool, given the questions that are posed by the energy transition. We want to equip, policymakers with the right tool to make those difficult decisions. But this strategy refresh helped us. But also, I think when we're looking at, for example, we have a big program on climate and sustainability, and we have a big program on electricity and renewable. And the young generation is very attracted to these ideas around new technologies such as renewable, hydrogen, climate and sustainability. So we've been blessed in being able to attract a lot of young talents and developing them. And I think this is an issue that is faced by the industry, especially the oil and gas, with the really, I think, high average age of professional staff in those companies. I think at CAPSARC, being a young institution, but also I think being in a place where we have a lot of, I think momentum. I think Ben spoke about, the velocity of change here in Saudi. It's a very exciting time. A lot of the talent that we have, whether, from Saudi or from outside of Saudi, because we have, I think, 30% of our staff are recruited globally, actually. And so it's been
Which
easier
means
to
ultimately you have to compete commercially, right? I mean, that's part of this big change is obviously rewarding a talent box that maybe in the past the kingdom wasn't familiar with compensating.
No, I think definitely we revolutionized, I think, the working environment, the compensation, but also I think we give something that is very difficult to achieve sometimes elsewhere, which is a sense of satisfaction. When you see your, work being actually happening and you see it materialized, that gives a sense of satisfaction that I think, you might not see it easily happening in a slower moving country. And I think in Saudi, everything is moving today at at a fast
at hyperloop speed, I think is what it is.
Exactly.
Hyperloop. Bob, just you could obviously speak well to that, coming from Dow to SABIC, but in the environment of the United States, the challenge of the industry being one where you're losing all the best minds to Silicon Valley and trying to keep them in the energy space as a wider industry. Obviously, it's very broad, chemicals and beyond that. But how can that be overcome, and is it being overcome?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. Just to confirm, can you hear me okay? I know we had some issues. Yeah, look, I think this is it's a great challenge because I think as well highlighted, we need the best minds engaged in this challenge, right? If you look at our sector in petrochemicals, you look at oil and gas, and you look at the investment needed in the energy transition in driving carbon neutrality and addressing plastic waste and other challenges, we need the best engineers, the best chemists, the best material scientists, best computer science. We need the best of all those skill sets. And whether it's in Saudi Arabia or it's in the US or Europe, this is a challenge. But what we've seen is that driving for purpose is what attracts and retains employees, right? Being clear in your intention, being clear on setting ambitious goals, making sure that your strategy and your senior leadership are aligned on driving against these initiatives are what are key, right? Employees today want to see that they can contribute to big global initiatives, that they can bring their capabilities, not just for bottom line profit, but for broader stakeholder engagement and impact. And that stakeholder versus shareholder thought process and that broader view is what enables employees to feel like they can bring impact. And so we're seeing that happen. We can clearly see in the kingdom the advantage that our broader sustainability messaging and investments are driving. And honestly, globally, we see the same. Like we have a very global footprint of technology and business resources across all the regions. And whether it's in the US or Europe, Asia, or KSA, those initiatives around plastic circularity, around carbon neutrality, are very connected to what the young research group coming out are tied to and what they're motivated by. But what they're really motivated by is not just talking the talk, but seeing it connected to business strategy, right? That what they're going to do is not just a project that is interesting to work on, but that is directly tied to the business priorities. And that's been key for us to retain talent because it is a challenging marketplace for sure.
That it matters ultimately. The rubber meets the road, as the saying goes. Just getting into sort of closing comments now, Ben. I'd really welcome where we started with you, coming back to, because I think it's an important point where security, energy security, which of course is very much in the headlines globally at the moment. It should have been for a long time, but it's very much front and center now. And at the same token, coming face to face with the energy transition and how those two can stick together. We're seeing coal prices at record highs, or certainly 10-year highs, a big return to nuclear. Your thoughts on how these two stay together in the context of the sort of transition in the kingdom?
Yeah, well, here in Washington, I went to an event yesterday on energy security, and we've rediscovered the importance of this term, I think, after about probably 7 years of taking it for granted. Look, I think we need everything. We're going to need continued investment in oil and gas for a long time. There's obviously a critical role for the big oil producers and the low-cost producers to play there. But all companies need to have business strategies and plans that are aligned with a changing world, a Paris Agreement aligned world, lower carbon world. That means national oil companies have to pivot and develop these new business lines that we've been discussing. The majors are pivoting. Everyone's trying to figure out what role they can play in this world. But it's all about comparative advantage. Saudi Arabia's had a comparative advantage in traditional energy in the past. There are a lot of reasons to think it could develop a comparative advantage in things like green hydrogen, electrolysis, low carbon fuels. And so it's exciting to watch Saudi Arabia, the state companies in the country start to pivot and develop these resources. And for all the reasons we've discussed, I think there's good reason to think they can succeed. And the pace is definitely picking up. It's impressive.
It is impressive, but the one thing we cannot invent right now is more time. So we have run out of time, unfortunately. And this is only the beginning of a dialogues, as it says, the Microsoft Saudi Arabia Sustainability Dialogues, the start of a conversation to play a part, however small, in helping to get to that next step, accelerate that pathway and roadmap to net zero. Let's close out by giving our host, Omar Saleh, the opportunity to make closing comments.
Well, thank you, Sean, Fahd, Bob, and Ben. It's been a very exciting conversation for sure. And I think I couldn't agree more. There is a lot of excitement altogether. There is a sense of purpose. And that's one thing. I think the motivation that Bob touched on as well is bringing that into acceleration of innovation. Our teams, and we see it actually, it's happening. Our people are very excited about the sense of purpose that this is bringing. And I think we're all in, the private, the public, and the academia partnership is what will enable and allow for this. So thank you for a great panel.
Well, thank you, Omar, and thank you to everybody for their participation. Dr. Bob Maughan, of Executive Vice President, CTO, and CSO of SABIC. Maybe in a year's time we might add CFO on top of that as well, where you bring the money into the same bucket. Ben Cahill, Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and of course, Engineer Fahd, President of CAPSARC, the very, very innovative center. And now, and I think that's incredibly wise, moving into that advisory role. I'm not sure if it's as wise, Fahd, as seeing University of North Carolina into the final of the final four, and not University of North Carolina State University, where you went to, of course. That is that big rivalry in that corner, isn't it? Duke, North Carolina State, very exciting days there in the basketball field. But we'll have to wrap it up there. And thank you for joining us on this episode of the Saudi Arabia Sustainability Dialogues.